friends. Welcome to Nerdy Bitz, TLDL, Too Long, Didn't Listen. I'm your host, the Reverend Tracy, and this is where we take one study, one concept, or one piece of psychology and break it down so you get all the nerdy good stuff without the textbook hangover. So this one is a little bit different than what I originally planned. This is meant to be the TLDL companion to part 2 of our episode on pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. And my plan was to come in here and break down what we were talking about with those golden era comparisons. You know, the idea that people used to be able to afford housing, education, and healthcare. So if they could do it, you should be able to do it now. And we are still going to touch on that conversation. I think it's crazy important to talk about it. But this morning, while I was getting ready to record, I came across a piece of research that fits this topic so perfectly that I basically dropped everything to go read it. So if this feels a little more hot off the press than usual, that's because it is. And what I found honestly reframed the entire conversation in a way I wasn't expecting. So here's the question I want to answer today. Why does it feel like everyone else is succeeding while you're struggling? And more importantly, is that actually true? The short answer is probably not. And the reason has to do with a kind of bias in how we perceive success and failure, what researchers are calling a failure gap. This idea comes from recent psychology research covered by SciPost in 2026, looking at how people estimate success and failure rates across different areas of life. This idea comes from a recent psychology research post covered by SciPost just today on April 22nd, 2026, looking at how people estimate success and failure rates across different areas of life, which is the idea that we consistently underestimate how often things go wrong. Across individuals, across systems, across society as a whole. What's interesting about this research is how consistent the pattern is. Across different areas of life, people were asked to estimate how often things succeeded versus fail. And over again, they guessed that success was more common than it actually is, meaning we're not just a little off, we're systematically off. Our brains are building a picture of reality that is more successful than reality actually is. And that matters because we use that picture to judge ourselves. In other words, we don't just overestimate success, we underestimate failure. And that might sound like a small difference, but it has huge implications for how we understand ourselves. Because think about what you actually see day to day. You see people getting jobs, but not the dozens or hundreds of applications that didn't go anywhere. You see relationships that exist, not the ones that quietly ended. You see businesses that succeed, not the ones that never made it past the first year. So you see outcomes. You don't see attempts. Let me make this really concrete. Imagine 2 people apply for the same job. One gets it, one doesn't. You see the person who got the job. They update their profile, they share the news, everyone celebrates with them. You don't see the dozens, sometimes hundreds of people who applied and didn't get that same outcome. Now, multiply that across literally everything. Creative projects, dating, starting a business, trying to change careers. You are constantly being shown the person who made it and almost never shown the people who didn't. So your brain starts to build a story. This works more often than it actually does. And that creates a really important distortion because if all you see are the successes, it starts to feel like success is common, expected, normal. And if success feels normal, then failure starts to feel like a personal problem, like something is wrong with you. When in reality, failure is happening all the time, all around us. We're just not seeing most of it. And here's where this gets bigger than just individual experience. Because if an entire culture is underestimating failure, then we start building beliefs on top of that misunderstanding. We start telling stories about success that are cleaner, simpler, more controlled than they actually are. And that's where things like the bootstraps narrative really take hold. It connects directly back to that bootstraps conversation. Because the idea of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps depends on a very specific assumption that if you work hard enough, you will succeed. But if we're underestimating how often effort doesn't lead to success, then that assumption starts to break down. Not because effort doesn't matter, but because effort never guarantees outcome. It never has. And when we're operating inside this bias, it's really easy to overcredit success to effort alone and undercredit everything else. Timing, opportunity, environment, sometimes just flat out luck. So now let's bring it back to that golden era idea for just a second. When people say, well, people used to be able to do it, what they're usually pointing to our visible successes. People who did buy homes, paid for college, managed medical costs. But what we don't see as clearly are the failures, the people who couldn't buy, the people who dropped out, the people who struggled financially in ways that didn't make it into the story. So not only were the conditions different, we're also working with incomplete data. We're comparing our full reality to a filtered version of someone else's. And that's a tough comparison to win because it's not actually a fair comparison. And this shows up in really personal ways. You send out resumes and don't hear back. It feels like you're the only one struggling. You try to build something and it doesn't take off. It feels like everyone else figured something out that you didn't. You hit a setback and it feels like you're falling behind. But what you're not seeing is how many other people are having similar experiences in that exact same moment. Because those moments don't get broadcast. Because when failure is invisible, it doesn't just distort how we see others. It distorts how we see ourselves. It makes normal human experiences feel like personal deficiencies. And that's a heavy thing to carry, especially when it's based on incomplete information. And this is where that phrase, "I want to leave you with," matters so much. You're not seeing the full data set. You're seeing the highlight reel. And when you make judgments about yourself based on incomplete information, you're almost always going to be harder on yourself than you should be. So what do we do with this information? This isn't about lowering expectations or saying success doesn't matter. It's about recalibrating your understanding of what's normal. Failure is normal. Setbacks are normal. Trying something and it not working, still perfectly normal. And when you start to factor that back into the picture, two things happen. First, you get a more accurate view of reality. And second, you get a little more room for yourself, a little more patience, a little more compassion, because you're no longer holding yourself to a standard that was built on incomplete information. So yeah, I was going to come in here and talk about housing and education and healthcare. And again, we will. But honestly, this layer underneath it might matter even more. Because before we even get to the systems and structures, we have to understand the lens we're using to interpret what we see. And right now, that lens is a little bit distorted. We don't just overestimate success. We underestimate how often things fail. And that changes the story. That's your Nerdy Bitz. Your brain's been comparing incomplete data. Now you've got a little more of the full picture.
Subscribe to Friends Talking Nerdy
on YouTube Music, Apple Podcasts, Spotify,
or wherever you listen to podcasts.
Bye, friends.